Hello and welcome to all to this webinar on solitude, solidarity, sacrifice during the pandemic, which is hosted by APA Division 52, International Psychology. This webinar is part of an ongoing series to celebrate activities of psychologists around the world, to provide useful information for international engagement, and to encourage us to take a broad and global perspective. My name is Pina Marsico, and along with Luca Tateo are your co-hosts for today's webinar. We want to thank the other members of the webinar committee, Dr. Falu Rami, Dr. Karen Brown, Dr. Mary Bullock, and Daniel Balba. Before we begin, our online audience have the ability to ask questions by typing them in the chat box located at the bottom left of your screen. Please feel free to type your question during the presentation. Luca will be making note of them, organizing them, and in the last 12 minutes or so, Luca will present them to Martin Dege for discussion. At this time, I will introduce and welcome our guest speaker. It's a great pleasure to have you, Martin, here with us. Martin Dege is Assistant Professor of Narrative Inquiry at Pratt Institute, Brooklyn, New York. Martin's research follows three strands. On the empirical level, he investigates how concept of crisis shape our everyday life and the narratives we deploy to make meaning of the world around us. On the theoretical level, he is interested in the historical emergence of psychology as a discipline. And on the institutional level, he explores concept of digital humanities and how digitalization changes both research and teaching. So welcome to our guest speaker. I leave the floor to you, Martin.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Pina. I will get into it directly and share a screen with you. Here we go. I will follow today what Pina just described as the second strand in my research, I believe. So the idea is to go back sometime and question some people at the beginnings of academic psychology with respect to what they can maybe tell us about the pandemic. And to do so, I go in 3 steps. It's always 3 with me for whatever reason. I will talk a little bit about COVID. I will talk about ideas beyond COVID, maybe. Then I will talk about what I weirdly entitled alternatives here because I couldn't come up with anything better, where I will ask 3 questions. And the first question, what is society? I will ask Emile Durkheim. The second question is, what is the nature of the bond between the human being and society, which I will ask Max Weber. And then there's a third question, what can a genuine person do, which I will ask Georg Simmel. And after I have asked all these 3 old white males what they think, maybe we can come up with some useful conclusion for today. Okay, let's get into it. As I said, we start with COVID, the current situation. It took a little under a month from December 27th in 2019 when Vision Medicals, that's the company that analyzed the specimen sent by the Wuhan Central Hospital, detected a novel coronavirus that they originally received a sample on December 21st. So it took a little bit over a month until January 2030 that an international health emergency was declared by the World Health Organization. A pandemic was declared on March 11, and 2 days later, the World Health Organization declared Europe to be the center of the pandemic, so it had moved. The attempts at mitigating the COVID-19 outbreak followed classic strategies, scientific strategies, if you want to. So chains of transmission needed to be broken. That's what we're still working on. Healthcare for those in need should be provided, also something we're working on. Attempts at screening were put up. Maybe some of you remember that when you were traveling at the very beginnings of the pandemic. Suddenly everywhere body temperature was measured in an attempt to diagnose people who are potentially ill in front of public buildings, in universities, particularly in airports, even with more sophisticated technology than we see right here. Other technology was used and promised, the tracking. Maybe some of you have apps that they use for tracking COVID. Maybe this technology didn't really live up to its promises. And of course, there is the omnipresent flattening the curve that we are all working on. So at this juncture, already in May, March, it's also that public health officials first appeared on stage and had things to say about the pandemic. I'm just taking two here. It's the US Surgeon General, Jerome Adams, and in the bottom, the back then not so famous and now maybe world famous Anthony Fauci, who introduces here in April 2020 a term we are all familiar with today, namely social distancing. So in many ways, public life came to a halt. We have all experienced it. Social distancing, wearing masks, the absence of public events with in-person gatherings became what some of us have called or termed the new normal. So while there was debate about wearing masks in the beginning, so both populists like Trump expressed their ideas about wearing masks, but there were also doctors, for example, Frank Ulrich Montgomery, the vice president of the World Medical Association in the beginning said, better not wear masks because the general public doesn't know how to put on masks. So the risks of putting them on and taking them off might actually be higher than the value they have from the protection. Fauci was also critical in the beginning. By now, they have all changed their opinion. Masks are generally accepted. Many of us have by now experienced the so-called lockdown or shutdown in one or another form. At least in Western countries, total movement control is not the way to go, maybe with the exception of Australia's 4-month lockdown in Victoria. But first studies show, specifically if we look at the Hubei area in China, that the total movement control is actually a rather successful way of mitigating the pandemic. The educational sector, which I suspect most of us work in, was hit hard. There are different numbers out there. Some suggest that up to 50% of the world's student population is affected by long distance learning, remote learning, or no learning at all. So as with masks and social distancing, there were initial arguments against the lockdown strategies on the political scene, prominently in the populist fashion of, if you remember that, Bolsonaro. There is a Twitter post for you here. And of course, the Twitter posts in all caps by former President Trump. But there were also researchers who had a different opinion. I suppose many of you have heard about Anders Tegnell, the architect of the Swedish strategy that did not rely on any lockdown strategies. So there's little argument now that the Swedish strategy has failed. The king himself has said so. Brazil would probably be better off had they had a different strategy from early on, and the same is true for the United States. So various arguments have been brought forward against general lockdowns, and they're still under discussion, like abuse of state power, lack of discrimination according to the impact on social groups, demographics, local areas, impact on the economy, and so forth. Yet there are cost-benefit analyses that show that lockdowns are, in effect, efficient tools. They're cheaper than the absence of a lockdown, the costs of the absence of a lockdown. Okay. So-called psychosocial effects are also analyzed and shown increased distress, family harm, domestic violence, and with many European countries experiences their second, third, even fourth wave of lockdown. The outcry for all this to heaven end becomes louder. This is maybe exaggerated by a looming perspective of a successful vaccination. So in this stage of increased discrepancy between state measures built on scientific insight and perceived and other desires of the public, we increasingly see things like that. Protests in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Germany, in other countries against the lockdown measures. So it's perhaps a reflection of the state of our discipline of psychology as a science, if that's what it is, as a Wissenschaft, if you want to, and its place in the public eye, that the behavioral sciences and psychology are often confused. They're intermingled, confounded in these debates. Amongst others, Stephen Reicher argued that in The Guardian. He speaks of a fundamental attribution error in the finest psychological fashion, in the way in which psychology and behavioral sciences are approached. Generally speaking, failures to abide by COVID-19 rules and restrictions are attributed to character flaws of the perpetrators. People who resist the lockdown, who believe in conspiracy theories, who take the risk of the virus lightly are psychologized as crazy, uneducated, angry, and so forth. That is, they're considered to be what psychologists at least used to call abnormal, okay? And on top of that, they become infantilized, right? They're too silly to wear masks. And so maybe we can provide them with some helpful, funny-looking instructions. The consequence of this psychologization, infantilization, and the creation of a shift of blame is an inability to talk, and perhaps more importantly, an inability to listen to these groups. So in the age of cognitive dissonance, the ill-fated confusion of behavioral sciences and psychology seems to suggest a general we, a statistical average social animal that acts based on in-group, out-group phenomena and seeks to blame their fellow human beings for failure and misfortune by psychologizing them as, you name it, stupid, loony, crazy, that is to say, abnormal. At the same time, and in the best fashion of cognitive dissonance, this social animal fails to reflect upon its own misgivings, failures, and violations of rules. What we often hear of is the resilience concept. It's maybe key here. Question is, are we, psychologists often use this, we able to adapt our behavior to tough times, to give up the things we value, and if so, for how long? The we in such questions refers to a statistical, trans-historical, and metaphysical we, the we of the human being as a social animal. So based on this analysis, based on the analysis of then so-called factors that have a positive or negative influence on our resilience, we can be nudged to pee in the right corner or to do the right thing given the right incentives. A closer look at the actual lockdown scenarios reveals quite a different picture of this social animal, or so I would argue. First off, in contrast to what was feared by some, the lockdown measures were largely accepted and people adhered to them. More so, people came together in different contexts with a sense of community and mutual support. Mutual aid group emerged and various alternative ways of social exchange were created in solidarity. Rather than individualized, statistical, infantile we's that are controlled or guided, or indeed, if you want to, nudged by government measures into doing what is supposed to be the right thing, we witness a largely unexpected creative empowerment released by human beings coming together in solidarity. Okay. Beyond COVID, I want to unfold a diagnosis that is some 100 years, even more by now, old of the current situation that maybe, I think, becomes more transparent during the times of COVID than before. Edmund Husserl, the German philosopher, gave 3 talks in Vienna and Prague in 1933, 5 years before he died. The talks were entitled The Crisis of European Sciences and Psychology and The Crisis of Humanity in Europe. In these talks, Husserl identifies the problem with the advent of the modern sciences. That's where all our problems for him come from. He argues that all value is removed from the world because immediate experience is removed. Instead, we live in a time that is governed by mathematics and statistics. And he also talks about the forces of technology in kind of a foresight of what would come from Martin Heidegger a little bit later. So the triumph, he argues, of modern Europe through its science and technology had led to its opposite, a crisis of humanity itself that is expressed in an explosion of archaic and irrational energies. Serge Moscovici, the French psychologist, points out that this diagnosis was in fact brought forward already some 30 years earlier by the German sociologist, philosopher, founder of social psychology, if you will, Georg Simmel. Simmel wrote, and this is one of the many quotes that I'm going to show you now, "The deepest problem of modern life derived from the claim of the individual to preserve the autonomy and individuality of his existence in the face of overwhelming social forces, of historical heritage, of external culture, and of the technique of life. The fight with nature, which primitive man has to wage for his bodily existence, attains in modern form its latest transformation," right? In other words, we fight against society that we nonetheless need to survive and live. For Simmel, it's not the repression of instincts nor the domination of technology. The driving force behind the dehumanization is the objectification of human faculties, right? Maybe in other words, modern psychology, if you want to. So with the emergence of quantity here, that's what he describes as the primary quality, we're going downhill. Human beings are detached from their subjective personal allegiances. They place a distance between them and others, as well as their objects, in order to create value. Human beings and their possessions become represented in an abstract form, okay? So the central argument here is essentially to say that quantity as the primary quality continuously changes the balance between the mental and the affective universe. Everything circulates and can be exchanged with everything else. Individuals no longer succeed in recognizing themselves and what they're doing, nor the society in which they are living, save from a distance and a negative way. The kinds of linkages between us that originate in a mixture of sentiments and interests become fragmented and sterilized. Personal relationships are converted into impersonal ones, in which a human being is, as it were, a thing for another human being. So in essence, Simmel diagnoses a withdrawal of subjective personality and sells to us as the profile of modernity. The quality of social life, I think that's one of the interesting expressions that he uses here. The quality of social life becomes its quantity. We're collecting impersonal relationships. Every human being becomes completely unique. And because we become completely unique in our quantities, we become completely interchangeable. Individuals are isolated and lack any common yardstick. So we're constantly asked to judge, to behave towards others, to carry out tasks according to specific formula. Just to back that up with another quote here, this psychological feature of our times is reflected in the necessity of continuous mathematical operations in our daily transactions. The lives of many people are absorbed by such evaluating, weighing, calculating, and reducing of qualitative values to quantitative ones. We're taught to determine and specify values down to the last farting, and thus enforced to apply a much greater precision in the comparison of various contents of life. Hence my toilet picture up there. Okay, so the individual that results is variously described as, this is not limited to Simmel, having a lack of character, the one-dimensional man, the man without qualities, Musil, Marcuse, others could be named. Or as Simmel says, and then I leave you alone with this depressing diagnosis, the style of society is the absence of any style. Okay, now, alternatives. If this above diagnosis holds true, at least to a certain extent, or if it's somehow a useful description, we could ask, how can we move beyond such debates, right? How can psychology provide, if we ask ourselves as psychologists, how can psychology provide a unique perspective on the needs, wants, and abilities of persons in a pandemic? How can we escape the statistical we, or the quantity as only quality, the definition of a human being on average, etc.? How can we escape descriptions of a fundamental attribution error and manifestations of the age of dissonance? Building on the evidence that we have so far, namely that people maybe behave differently in the pandemic than behavioral sciences would have expected, it seems maybe promising, so I believe, to rethink psychology from individual resilience to a psychology of collective solidarity. And that's what I'm trying to do in what's to come. Okay. And to do so, as I said before, I'm going to ask 3 questions. What is society from a psychological point of view? And I'm going to ask Durkheim to tell us what is the nature of the bond between individual and society? What can a genuine person, and I'm going to ask that Max Weber, and then what can a genuine person do in the face of society? Again, I'm asking Sibyl, because despite his diagnosis, I think he has something good to say. Okay, quick answers, and then longer ones. What is society? Well, society is perceived through the many people it brings together. They're bound by contract. That's a typical kind of explanation we get. What can we do in the face of society? Oh, well, according to Durkheim, at least, we have to come aware of our constraints, and we have to stop living the illusion that we can escape those constraints, because if we try, it normally results in what he calls a social drama, right? Okay, and that also already answers kind of what we can do. So the idea would be to say there are more prohibitions, in fact, in society. Think of the 10 Commandments. That's something that Durkheim quotes there, as there are things we're actually allowed to do. Or he also brings up, he also talks about the upbringing of children, etc., etc., etc. Okay, good. What is society from a psychological point of view? Let's see whether I can get there. So first off, with Durkheim would say that society, or an important aspect of society is religion. Maybe society is a form of religion, right? The idea is we follow the rules of society for religious reasons. We're bound together by a belief in the absurd. We somehow believe in the absurd, in something absurd together. Religion in this understanding is a set of representation that accounts for the functioning of the universe and normal life. In other words, it explains to us why we're here and why things are happening, to a certain extent at least. Those religious phenomena within religion, right, within society then, if you want to, they stand in isolation. They're protected by prohibitions and prescripts. And the most important one for Durkheim, and that relates to our pandemic right now, is the one of contact. We're not allowed to touch the impure, right? And right now we're not allowed to touch each other because we're all impure, potentially at least. And at least Durkheim argues that all other prohibitions are a variation of that. So we have a distinction in society. It's the profane and the sacred. And for Durkheim, the two are mutually excluding each other. He writes, since the idea of the sacred is always and everywhere separated from the idea of the profane, and since we picture a sort of logical chasm between the two, the mind irresistibly refuses to allow the two corresponding things to be confounded. For such a promiscuity would contradict the dissociation of these ideas in the mind. The sacred thing is par excellence that which the profane should not touch and cannot touch with impunity, right? Okay. So the claim is, without the sacred irrational, societies won't hold together, right? They have, in principle, the power to give themselves their own gods. We don't need the actual religious god. The society gives them their own gods, their own gods. And those gods are then related to, if you want to, the Freudian totemism, right? We need objects that are sacred, like national flags, other examples, you name it. And of course, we have to instill a sacred character into members of our society. Here maybe are some of our gods, either by fashion or by vocation. We all have to somehow believe in at least some of those totems so that we stand together, and we have to believe in those totems that the firefighters help us, for example, collectively for a society to function. So the important thing here is to say, I'll get to that in a moment, society rests upon a psychological phenomenon, to believe in something, right? This idea of the original contract, the social contract theory, is one of the most dominant theories within moral and political philosophy in the Western world, doesn't hold from a psychological perspective. It also doesn't necessarily hold anymore from a philosophical one. It has been under attack in recent years from race-conscious philosophers and also feminists, etc. Okay, but anyways, so from this point of view, together with, this is kind of how the story goes of the social contract theory. People come together, and together with egoism, as it is assumed, we're all egoistic, antagonistic relationships emerge. Everyone wants everything at the expense of everyone else. And then a contract comes around and solves the entire thing. And so the social world appears. But from a psychological point of view, as I said, it's maybe not working like that. And of course, it's not me who came up with that insight, but again, it's Durkheim who says, it is undoubtedly incorrect to believe that all social relationships can be reduced to a contract. All the more so because a contract assumes the existence of something other than itself, right? So a contract requires the parties to interpret their interest in a similar manner, to be engaged in complementary occupations, respecting certain values and so forth, right? So sharing some form of a common feeling, if you want to. Okay. And the feeling they share, for Durkheim, is a special feeling. It's a passionately sympathetic feeling for one's family, one's fellow countrymen, one's occupation. Yes, Durkheim loved France. It's the greater alliance that is important here. So agreement between the individuals, this agreement between the individuals that we see as a contract is just a visible part of something psychological that is going on. Instead, the society here for Durkheim is held together by a constraint, and that constraint is, and that's the first word of my subtitle. Is it the first? I don't know. Solidarity, right? So he writes, this gives rise to a solidarity sui generis, which, deriving from resemblances, binds the individuals directly to society. This solidarity does not consist merely in a general, indeterminate attachment of the individuals to the group, but is also one that concerts their detailed actions. We constantly act based on solidarity with others, not out of egoism. That's the argument here. Okay. And this consensus is the expression of such solidarity. As such, the spoken word is maybe the most outstanding vehicle of the solidarity, since it always assumes a consultation and communication for it to be formulated. In the terms of, in the French terms of Serge Moscovici, it's nous entendons, we agree, but also we hear, we literally hear each other. Okay. Good. So solidarity as the basis of society. What is the nature of the bond? My second question that I want to ask Max Weber between individual and the society. So Max Weber's sociology, and this is part of the argument here of the Moscovici argument that I am following, it also rests on psychology, on a form of psychology, but it's very different from what Durkheim is offering us. Weber describes the political society, a society that is governed by passions, right? In many ways, he comes out of a revolutionary state that he describes, and then wants to somehow explain how through rationalization we enter into a more normal state, as he would claim. So his society needs charisma and a charismatic leader. And I think that's a topic that is maybe more up to date than it was 10 years ago, that there are people out there who govern with charisma. So, as I said, Durkheim tried to explain maybe the normal society. Weber tried to describe the anomalous or revolutionary society, where people are brought together by a new charisma and feel that they're somehow at the very foundations of what's going on, or at least touching those very foundations when, for example, to take a negative example, walk into the Capitol and film themselves and think that it will go without consequences, or end in what they feel there as a kind of status nascendi, if you want to. Okay, so the hero in Weber, the charismatic leader, is the modern saint, if you want to. Is a modern prophet. He's a hero, and the essential qualities that we want to all see in those heroes is maybe sincerity and intuition, right? So it's the idea of the individual maybe taken to the extreme. So in line with earlier questions that I have raised, I could maybe ask, why do human beings submit to power under specific circumstances? And what inner justifications and outer circumstances are necessary here? Weber describes this in Politics as Vocation and says it's, in the English translation, violence or force. In the German original, it's Gewalt, which is a complex word that means all kinds of things, including violence and force. But also the branches of government are called Gewalten in German, so that's what it makes the translation tricky here. Anyways, it's this Gewalt, this violence, and legitimacy, right? What's the formula for legitimacy? Inner faith and external violence in the right proportion. But then also, if you know Weber a little bit, you know that Weber always speaks in his kind of ideal case scenarios. So you read Weber and he comes up with long descriptions. And then at one point, there's one paragraph where he says, actually, it's more complicated than this. This is one of those paragraphs. So purely material interests and calculations of advantages as the basis of solidarity between the chief and his administrative staff result in a relatively unstable situation. Normally, other elements, effectual and ideal, supplement such interests. In certain exceptional cases, the former alone may be decisive. In everyday life, these relationships, like others, are governed by custom and material calculation of advantage. But custom, personal advantage, purely effectual or ideal motives of solidarity do not form a sufficiently reliable basis for a given domination. In addition, there's normally a further element, the belief in legitimacy, right? So, power of party over nation, of teacher over classroom comes from faith. The faith is expressed, this faith expresses the kind of pressure, if you want to, that's how Weber would have it, of society acting with people, instilling discipline into them. Okay. Funnily, the characteristics of the leader that Weber describes are very similar to what we find in Freud, right? With the visionary, delusional, neurotic, but I will not get into this right now. Okay, so the question could be then belief. What does this legitimacy rely on? Another quote here, legitimacy thus results upon the belief in magical powers, revelations, and the hero worship. Okay, so much more than credibility, maybe we rely on personal affection. when we vote for certain politicians that we want to see in power. It's something psychological. We want to see consistency and endurance in a leader, right? We want to recognize that person by the same gestures, ever repeating utterances, etc., etc. Yes, we can, for example. Okay, so Weber argues that people tend to favor, that's how it goes in Weber, spectacular individuals. With Moscovici, we could turn this around and say it's a social psychological phenomenon. Utopian dreams take hold of imaginative and enthusiastic minds and incline them to follow those who promise their realization. Okay. I have another nice quote here. Maybe I'll leave it for you to read if you want to. Essentially, just another Weber scholar who tells us that charisma is a social, if you go to the very last line, a mass and social psychological phenomenon and not one of political sciences. Okay. What can a genuine person do in the face of society? I said I'm going to be talking a little bit about Georg Simmel. Georg Simmel looked for a third way between the individual and society, right? He starts out to mention there are essentially two approaches to society. One is to say society is the sum of its parts. The other one is to say it's qualitatively different from the people that walk in the society. And together with most likely many of you out there, Simmel rejects both solutions, right? Excuse me. So for him, society is the crystallization of concrete human actions in independent structures. And out of this, a society as a crystallization of concrete human actions in independent structures, Simmel understood there's no way to explain what's going on in society without a psychology. We need a psychology. And in Das Problem der Soziologie, he writes, the methods to study the problem of how phenomena are associated are the same for all the comparative psychological sciences. They're based on certain psychological assumptions that are peculiar to them alone, without which no historical science can exist. The phenomenon of seeking help and of giving it, love, hatred, avarice, and a feeling of satisfaction arising from an existence shared with others. Individual self-preservation goes on. And we must assume a series of other psychological processes in order to be able to understand fully how the associative state comes about, as also the formation of groups and individuals' relationships with the whole in its entirety, and so forth. Society is a genetic process here. Individuals are the raw material and the creators of this society, but they're not sufficient to explain it, right? Society can not be reduced to those individuals. Simmel comes with the example of the architect who tries to judge the building by the material it's made out of. There is another interesting quote by Simmel to underline this. A superficial rationalism, that's what we have maybe in, I don't know, I'll leave it at that. A superficial rationalism always looks for this richness solely among the concrete contents, right? Not finding it, it passes over sociability, taxed with being a shallow absurdity. Yet it is not without significance that in many European languages, society quite simply designates a social gathering, Gesellschaft in German, for example. Most certainly, what is political and economic, the aim of any description is a society. But only a socializing society is a society that lacks any qualifying adjective. So, society as a reciprocal mental action occurring between individuals. That means society consists of the daily, transitory, anonymous actions, walking, saying good day, goodbye, going to the cinema, sitting in a cafe. That's all society. It is always the interactions between the individuals that remain at the priority. So the interactions between the individuals is the starting point for all social formations. A systematic genetic analysis must begin from this most simple and immediate relationship, which even today is the source of innumerable new social formations. Further development replaces the immediacy of interacting forces with the creation of higher supra-individual formations, which appear as independent representatives of these forces and absorb and mediate the relations between individuals. These formations exist in great variety, as tangible realities and as mere ideas and products of the imagination, as complex organizations and as individual existences. That's what we need to study. So from this perspective, and that's maybe the important thing here, the starting point of any investigation of the social world is not the single individual, but the reciprocal action of a party of two observed by a third. Right? The reciprocal action of a party of two observed by a third. Okay. And with not Moscovici, but with Simmel, we could ask, where does the individual end and where does society begin? And the simple answer here would be society exists where the individual is real. This is then the justification that Moscovici picks up to say, we need to understand the social world in psychological terms. Okay. One more thing that I have to say so that we get to how we can act with Simmel in society. Simmel says there are two different realities out there. There's the reality out there, literally, that which remains outside the world of reality, and that which is inside the world of value, right? It's not magical. There's distinction made by others as well. The idea is to say there is the bread out there, and then there's the bread I eat, and then there's the bread that I prefer to eat, and it's two different things, right? So the world of reality remains outside the individual, while the individual world of value is used in order to judge it. Subjectivity then is the prime reason for value. This is how value comes about. And the characteristic feature of value, in contrast to reality, in turn, would be its subjectivity. So subjectivity is the outcome of an effective and mental process of maturation when I look at the outside world. It is the separation of the self from reality. I know I'm different from what is out there, and the confrontation of the self with this reality out there. Okay. Simmel describes here what he calls the law of distancing. In order to become this subjectivity, I have to push objects away from me. So objects become a value as a function of the distance I have to them, right? I think I have that on a quote. The subjective events of impulse and enjoyment become objectified in value. That is to say that they develop from the objective conditions, obstacles, deprivations, demands for some kind of price through which the cause or content of impulse and enjoyment is first separated from us and becomes by this very act an object and a value. Something that is out there that I do not have, but that I desire, at the same time makes sure that I know that I exist. The moment I have it, it might actually stop to be an object for me, right? Okay. Good. So, and now what do we do when we have those objects? And the description of value is actually much more complicated, but I want to focus on exchange here. We exchange objects, right? So exchange is the moment in which the objects that I demand appear to be equally demanded by others. We need to acquire an object we desire through another object. And through exchange, value becomes a category and beyond subjectivity, a category beyond subjectivity and objectivity, as Simmel argues here. The form taken by value in exchange places value in a category beyond the strict meaning of subjectivity and objectivity. In exchange, value becomes supra-subjective, supra-individual, yet without becoming an objective quality and reality of the thing themselves. Value appears as the demand of the object, transcending its immanent reality, to be exchanged and acquired only for another corresponding value. Okay? Now, we live in a world where we all want objects. In order to get those objects, we go into exchange. And of course, the argument for Simmel is then we have to analyze money. I'm not going into this right now. I'm going into another aspect that he mentions, a psychological aspect, and that is that of sacrifice. I think the third word in my subtitle. So exchange is the relationship of relationships, right? Exchange is what bonds individuals to a group. We exchange things, and thereby, even though I don't see any of you, I think I'm exchanging something by sacrificing something. I exchange something, and thereby we bond together. If this exchange is interrupted, if the internet breaks, our society here ceases to exist. If the lockdown is complete, society ceases to exist. It can never be, but if it was. Every interaction has to be regarded as a form of exchange. And in many cases, more is given than is received. Most of the time, we actually give more than we get back. So exchange is therefore not giving in order to receive or sell in order to buy. Instead, one gives and receives and sells and buys in order to exchange, to establish a reciprocal relationship, right? So in short, we exchange, and thus we are a society, right? And what is it we're exchanging? Effectively, we're exchanging sacrifices. But here we overlook that sacrifice is by no means always an external obstacle, but is the inner condition of the goal itself and the road by which it may be reached. We divide the enigmatic unity of our practical relation to things into sacrifice and gain, abstraction and attainment. And since the different stages are often separated in time, we forget that the goal would not be the same without impediments to overcome. The resistance that we have to overcome enables us to prove our strength. Only the conquest of sin secures for the soul the joy of heaven that the righteous man cannot enjoy. Okay. So sacrifice creates a relationship that maintains a difference between two persons, right? I do something for someone else and sacrifice something, and thereby keep the other person at a distance, and thereby also keep myself. This is how I act in society. And value there then is the charisma of this exchange, if you want to. Okay. Now, what do we do with this? Serge Moscovici says, every society in time had their theory. And he claims that our society is the one of decomposition. This is how he spells it out. The representation of the society in which we live is vanishing. From its viewpoint, the institutions, state structures, churches, and class divisions exist only within a flow of connections and comparisons that link them with one another. Everything consists of dependency, liaison, contact, and metamorphosis. Nothing persists in any absolute fashion, and everything is composing and decomposing incessantly, just as the decomposition of water into hydrogen and oxygen is a continual preparation for a new synthesis of water. There is no stable object that is society, right? Just as with the object that has value only in exchange. Society only exists in a constant movement of decomposition of ideas. The moment we realize that there cannot be an absolute framework, a definitive object, or the idea that binds us, we at the same time realize that such an object or framework is a necessary illusion, right? We have to all buy into something like this. So we constantly seek these objects that have significance in themselves and not only in exchange. This multiplicity of actions and relationships in search for the object, for the objects that have significance in themselves is then maybe that which we call a society. One final quote, I think. So in fact, society is therefore not a substance. It is something that happens, as Simmel says, ein Geschehen. It is the way in which each individual receives his destiny from another person and is shaped by him or her, and in which each individual fulfills the destiny of the other person by shaping it in his turn. Okay. It's not enough to say that society becomes ever more rational, as in the case of Weber. Yes, through money, society becomes more rational through exchange. But in this process, the representations of society change. And with them, its rationality changes. So go further on this. The idea of rationalization depends on the idea of science today, right? Science believes that everything can be seen by different observers in the same way, given the right tools. But we don't live in this world of enlightenment anymore. We live in a world driven by economy. We witness a transition from absolutes to relatives. We live in a world with a rationality that lacks any stable framework or independent dimension. Each time we set about an action or transaction, the equilibrium shifts. So there's a free floating of society. And that almost means that at any given point in time, society does not exist. Only in movement it exists. The consequence then is not, as some would claim, to each their own, but that the truth for each individual always arises from the contact with and in relationship to the truth of others, taking into account the situation in which they are. So the realization that we all speak from our own perspective, that there is no absolute perspective from which everything can be seen, is not a weakness. It is the precondition for everyone to speak, and as such, the precondition for exchange and for making everyone distinctly the same that it is, right? So, okay. So the important distinction here, we need a new rationality. We have to move away from classic rationality to an idea of a modern rationality that is a rationality of exchange. And then the rationality of exchange during the pandemic or otherwise, the role of the state or any other institution for that matter would not be to explain scientific rationality to infantilize citizens or members. Instead, it would provide a scaffolding to support exchange. If exchange stops, society ceases to exist. This might be difficult to achieve, to keep this exchange going. But psychologically speaking, however, it appears that the human condition is not dominated by rationality and egoism, but by passion and solidarity. Instead of individualizing society, we can trust in the power of the people coming together, or so I hope. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much, Martin. It was a very dense and rich presentation. So while we give people time to think and to type down their questions, I will start with the first comments or question and comment remarks by Hans Dorsch. So if you want to say something to that. So Hans writes, Simmel, philosopher, 1858-1918. He, as I see it, speaks into a context of post-German unification and to a certain degree, a European power struggle, culminating with World War I. Placed in this context, his word changes meaning, I would say. And he add another comment to your later talk. I rather see this we need, in brackets, as high use, in brackets, with this high being anyone who wishes to use this group mechanism for controlling purposes. Finally, of course, he makes a compliment, it's brilliant, but he also said that it reminds him somehow Giddens. So yeah. If you have any comment on this?
Well, the timestamps are actually useful, so maybe I can go back later on to the recording and see at what point in time during my presentation Hans wrote this, so that I can actually answer some of it. He doesn't seem to be too happy with where I placed a symbol. Maybe I somehow confused or mentioned the wrong time there. The Philosophy of Money was published, incidentally, together in the same year with the Traumdeutung in 1900. So if I confused anything there, sorry about that. I'd like to see him as one of the founding fathers of social psychology. I know that this is a controversial statement, potentially, but maybe some also would agree. I don't know. Yes, Giddens, of course. I didn't make it there. I was stuck with those old dudes in my analysis, but of course we could go way beyond this had we more time. I hope that's somewhat okay as a comment, and we could talk later more. Hans.
Then we have a question by Anna Sa. She asked, is it possible to realize another way of explaining society and individuals if we change the basic assumption of symbol of exchange to the notion of sharing?
Well, first off, exchange is of course not so far away from sharing. The idea behind relying on exchange versus, I mean, I see where you're coming from, to say sharing, okay, so we both have this object. I think in effect, with Simmel, we would describe that as a constant reproduction of exchange, because we never really, I mean, hardly ever in one moment share one object, but rather we exchange that object back and forth. And so by having an object together that we share, I think we do exactly what Simmel describes. Namely, we sacrifice that object if we share it with others, momentarily give it to others, and thereby produce exactly this kind of sacrifice that he identifies with, that I have identified here with solidarity.
Thank you. And next is Gordana, who wants to speak. So I give her the stage.
Okay, I'm scared now.
To talk now. Gordana, can you unmute? Okay.
And turn on your camera if you want to, so I can see another person. Only if you want to. Sorry, don't want to put you in the spot.
But I don't see that option.
Okay, then that's the technology.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much, Martin. If you allow me a comment, I mean, it was a lecture, a German lecture in the best sense from my standpoint. So I appreciate that very much. And also your references to non-psychologists who raised the fundamental questions to psychology. So I think it says something about our science. But then some questions. Would you agree with my interpretation that a reference to charisma in Weber somehow contradicts his own thesis of modernization, rationalization, and disenchantment? And in that sense, it could be understood as a kind of regression to pre-modern patterns. And it is not so easy to connect it with ideas of democracy, which actually excludes, I mean, such a gap between charismatic person and other ordinary persons. And if you allow me just a second short question. I understand that exchange is necessary to reproduce societal bonds, but I'm skeptical whether any exchange is able to represent and then to reconstitute society, because they are powerful structures, I would say, in society, which are not available as experience of participants in exchange. And so we need tools to reach them in order to change them, because they also shape our interactions. So thank you.
Thank you, Gordana. About Weber and charisma, I agree with you in that charisma is an interesting concept within the whole theoretical building that Weber gives us. And this is precisely why I pick on it here together with others. Moscovici has done that before, to say it's so interesting that in this theory of sociology, he puts forth such a psychological element in there, that we somehow believe, without explaining it further, believe in this charismatic leader. Then, of course, it has been argued many times that this charisma is effectively anti-democratic, and that's maybe also not relevant anymore in our times. Others have argued differently. Think of Raymond Aron, for example. Others too that don't come to my mind right now. But what's happened in Raymond Aron, essentially his argument is, if I get it together in the right way right now, that this charisma is moving on from the charismatic leader to the institutions that become charismatic, right? But I mean, if we look at what's going on today, I think the search for a charismatic leader, specifically if we turn around the argument, if we don't argue in the fashion that Weber argued, to say there is this person that has particular attributes that people follow, but rather say that people want to believe in something, and then they align behind the person who promises them to give them what they believe in, right? I think charisma is something that's worthwhile studying from a psychological perspective. Is exchange everything to explain society? Definitely not, because as I said before, from the perspective of Simmel, we constantly engage in exchange, but what we effectively need, or what we're effectively looking for, is that one thing that cannot be represented in exchange, that does not receive its value from exchange, but that is beyond that we can believe in, right? That's what brings society together. I hear you. I think I hear what you're saying. You're rethinking it from a more critical kind of point of view. How can we challenge society and the structures as they exist? I think that was my argument. Was my argument today. The first challenge for the social structures as they exist would be to first acknowledge that we live in a society that is economically driven by a constant exchange, and therefore also the rationalities change constantly, and therefore we maybe, or what we can learn from that, and if we want to turn that into something critical, we can maybe understand that simply listening to science, be it during COVID, during the pandemic, or if you want to, with respect to climate change, the argument that science actually shows that we need to do something is the wrong argument. We don't live in this Enlightenment structure anymore. We have to come up with our rationality through exchange. We have to engage with everyone concerned. So this is, for me, the psychological argument here, where I want to turn around the idea of exchange and say it's actually worthwhile thinking about our society as a society of constant exchange.
Thank you, Martin. We have time just for one more question. I'm reading here. Actually, we don't have a question. We have rather a comment by Angela Branco. She says, I think charisma is very central to the present wave of populism all over the world. There's a comment. And if there is no other question, I would like to have a final one, a last one, if you allow me. Actually, what you presented is a dualistic view where you have on one side the pure individual, and a society has an aggregation of individuals, and a completely societal view. But I was thinking, is there instead a matter of of degree rather than completely qualitative difference, in the sense that all the intermediate, not individual bodies, such, for instance, family or other form of aggregation, which cannot be considered the same as society in a general sense. And actually exactly during the COVID time, these smaller or different intermediate bodies are proving to be the one that keep people together when you are forced basically to live, for instance, only with a few members of your family for a very long time. So what about these intermediate collective bodies?
First of all, I would object and say that's not a dualistic view that I'm presenting. I am trying to get exactly out of this dualism. The smallest unit to study is the interaction of two observed by a third, right? That's where we start. And that's the beginning of society. And well, we're running into a translation issue here, a Gesellschaft, right? A people coming together. So this is in the moment of action. This is, of course, a unit that we study. But if we study a family, then this family as a society is part of this larger entanglement of actions. So we are already in the moment of studying society. There is no such thing as, oh, there is a family, and then above the family, there is a society. That would exactly be the idea of a dualistic view. There's individuals, then individuals come together, then it becomes ever bigger. There is the dyadic element of, I don't know, a couple, and then they have a child, they become a family, and then they move in together in a house that they built with their parents. So it's a transgeneral family and whatever, then it becomes ever bigger. That's exactly not the idea. It's to say psychology. Society starts at two interacting, observed by a third. And from there, we'll take it in action. At every given moment in time, society does not exist. There are no general rules, general statements we can make about society, and we cannot see society out there other than observing action. And that's why we need psychology to study society. That's the idea.
Thank you very much. So it's been very fast, and we have time to take the last one if you want. Sure. Okay, so Rosa Traversa writes, I was fascinated by your remarks on psychologization and infantilization. On the one hand, and you stress on the, sorry, I missed that, on the notion of contract, which actually implies other reality beyond society. My question is, how about different contract-based rationalities, where psychology visibly plays a role? Like in the Margaret Thatcher statement, there is no society, only individuals and families. We go back to that. Is there any more rationality other than classical ones, other than modern irrationality?
Right. I mean, that's my argument was that in a society that relies on a constant exchange, we have to observe how rationality changes in this constant exchange, and that constant exchange takes place between individuals in communication and in action. So this is what we need to observe in order to understand how rationality itself is in a constant process of changing. What I said about contract, I just find that to be important because we have to somehow, as psychologists, if we want to talk about society, we have to argue, at least for a tiny moment, with those people in moral philosophy and political theory, because they claim to know what society is, and they normally come about with contract theories. And this is exactly a mirror of the idea of a rational society in modern terms, in Enlightenment terms. We come together, old white male dudes, and we agree on something and we write it down, and there we have our university founded, and there we have, you name it, right? So, but the contract is not the beginning. Something before that has happened. Those old white male dudes seek pleasure in coming together and doing things, drinking alcohol, whatever. You come up with the image that you want. There is a level before the contract takes place. And so I'm saying to political philosophy, to moral philosophy, there is a level before the contract is signed. We already want something from each other. And that something is a strong feeling of affection. We want to live in solidarity with others. That's what we want. And that's what we need the research, right? We're not egoistic. We're primarily, our primary goal is solidarity.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so sorry for I see other questions, but we have to close up. So let me thank all of you for participating, and thank Martin for this excellent presentation. Just let me remind you that we would love to hear from you in the audience about this webinar. So please provide feedback on your experience about both the content and the format of today's discussion. And on behalf of Division 52 Webinar Committee, enjoy the rest of your day and the upcoming weekend. And thank you very much again to all of you. Thank you, Pina. Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. Thank you all for participating. Email me with questions.